Hi everybody, this is going to be a series about the modules that make up most jazz standards. This is not going to be an exhaustive thing. I'm not going to list literally every chord progression in every tune, but these are common progressions that you may notice and should probably start to notice in commonplace jazz standards, bop tunes and things like that. Now, the value of this is partly that you can learn to hear these progressions on record. You can learn to recognize them when you see them in a chart. And also, you can use them as a basis for practicing your chordal voice leading, improvisation, and so on and so forth. So it gives you a structure to how to learn to play jazz, and it can be reflected in the repertoire of the music as well. Right. Okay, so today's lesson is going to be based on that great celebrity of jazz standards chord progressions, the 2-5-1. But I will lump this into the larger category of cadences based on 5-1. And probably if you weren't asleep in classical music theory class, you might remember that the 5-1 cadence is the most common and defining chord progression of Western classical music. So typically like, you know, G7, C major, right? I won't talk too much about that, just suffice to say that we're moving from a tense chord, a G7 chord, to a softer chord, a C major. And also that 5-1 motion is also related to the cycle as well. So if you stick a bunch of cadences together, you get a cycle progression. Now, usually in jazz, and this is not something that's true of all jazz, a lot of basic I say basic, but sort of older forms of jazz like traditional jazz, gypsy jazz, things like that, tend to use, you know, those dominant progressions, 5-1s, a lot more. But as we move into the bebop era, what becomes really common is 2 to 5 to 1 chord progressions. And that kind of takes our little cycle a step out. So we go D, G, C. Christmas gave Dad, okay? So we're just moving in fourths, D, G, C, going up. So we're back cycling again just by 3 steps. We have a D minor chord, usually, D minor 7, G7, and then I'm going to say C6, just because C6 is a less problematic major chord than C major 7th, which can clash sometimes in the melody. Okay, and this is a progression which we are obviously told to study a lot, and 2-5-1 progressions should form a basic part of any jazz musician's practice regimen. Now, I just wanted to say in Barry Harris' world, we tend to see the D minor 7 and the G7, we tend to lump them into the G7 scale. Barry Harris viewed the D minor 7 as purely being a suspension of G7. So we can always play over G7. But in Barry Harris, that actually means we use the G7 scale, which has all these different sounds in it. So I'm not going to go too far into that today, just to note that. Another thing which comes a little bit from Barry Harris, but actually goes way back to the sort of Baroque era, is the fact that this is purely an inversion of 4-6-5-7-1. And actually this progression I think is slightly more common in 18th century music. So you have the F6 chord there, and then G7, and then C major would be in that era. But for us, you know, maybe something more like that. Certainly for sort of early eras of jazz. You might do something obviously much more kind of coloristic than that, especially with the G7 chord, which can be altered or anything else. But the reason why I wanted to bring up this 4-5-1 chord progression is because it does occur sometimes in jazz standards. You can see it in, for instance, Almost Like Being in Love. And, you know, the progression is the same as a D minor 7, G7, C6. It's just got a different bass note, basically. And some theorists say that the 2 minor 7 is the definitive version because then you have the fourth-wise movement. This is an idea from, I think, from Jean-Philippe Rameau. But often the form you see in 18th century music is 4-5-1, and that's probably what a lot of people are familiar from other forms of music other than jazz. But in jazz, the 2-5-1 is undoubtedly the more common of those two possibilities. Okay, now it's quite common as well to see that chord turned into a dominant, so then it becomes more of a chromatic secondary dominant style 2-5-1, D7, G7, C6. Now you see that in tunes like Take the A Train, Me, Myself and I, Exactly Like You, Girl from Ipanema. Dozens of tunes do this in some guise or another. And, you know, it's quite nice as well if you take that 2-7 and then you try to substitute the 5-7. Something Django started doing in the 30s, but that little example is from Moonlight in Vermont. You can also see it in Satin Doll, for instance. Okay? Take the A Train is unusual in that the 2 chord has a sharp 11th added to it. It's almost part of the song. And then 2-5-1 there. So we're going to turn that 5-7 into a regular 2-5-1, like our first 2-5-1, D minor 7, which here I'm playing as an F6. If I just put the D in the bass, you'll hear it. Yeah, and then G7. Now we can also add in alterations to the 5-7 chord. Flat 3 of the key, which is sharp 5 here, is very common for like pre-war jazz. But you know, also flat 9s, flat 5s, what have you, you know, are very common in jazz, all of that stuff. So we can alter the G7 however we like. But putting a sharp 11th on a 2 chord has become very common, especially while soloing. Thanks Billy Strayhorn for that. And I wanted to indicate this suspended version, which relates to Barry Harris's view of a 2-5-1 as well. You do sometimes see this. This is a 5 sus chord, G9 sus4, G9, or you can put the flat 9 as well if you want to make it a bit more altered. And then C6. I'm going to put that C6 on a G bass, so you get that G pedal throughout. Very nice way to play a 2-5-1 sometimes. It can work well, for instance, in the bridge of All the Things You Are. I quite like doing it there. But if you just want to break things up and make it less boom, 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 that's quite a good way to do it. Okay, moving on, we're going to talk about the minor versions of these. So we have a vanilla minor 2-5-1, but it has a D minor 7 flat 5 in it, a G7, and either a C minor major 7th or a C minor 6th. C minor 6th is the more traditional sound here. Don't play a C minor 7th because that weakens the tonality. It makes it sound less like minor. Unless you're going on to the F7 chord, right? It's part of a larger cycle, like in, for instance, blues fretless. That's okay. But nobody played a flat 7 much on the minor chord until Kind of Blue came out. Most of the sort of swing era and bop era improvisers tend to emphasize the 6th on the 1 chord there. Check it out, it's true. And we also have the minor 4-5-1, which is the same. You see this a lot in Bach and stuff. Less the minor 6th on the tonic chord in classical music, but that's another way of playing the same thing. You get that in song tunes, particularly in gypsy jazz tunes, such as minor swing. Now, the thing about the F minor 6 is it was originally the D half diminished chord, D minor 7 flat 5, was originally understood as an F minor 6 with a 6th in the bass. So thinking about it as F minor can make it easier to solo through. Have a video about that. You might also want to use the F minor 6th diminished scale if you're a Barry Harris aficionado. And then it's quite a nice way to sort of play through that chord progression using the minor 6th chords. On the G7 I was using an A flat minor 6th diminished scale. A little bit beyond the scope of this video, but I just wanted to point that out. F minor 6th is generally an easier sound to deal with conceptually, I think, than D minor 7 flat 5. If you play a melodic minor on it, for instance. You get that beautiful, what's called the low croon sharp 2 sound, right? Without having to think about modes. Okay, variant minor 2-5-1. This is something that doesn't get talked about enough, I think, which is where we have a D minor 7th instead of half diminished chord as a 2. And then we get the G7 flat 9. G7 flat 9 is nice. You can also get G13 flat 9, which sounds really cool. C minor 6th. And you get that, for instance, in Billy's Bounce. So start. So if we look at it that way, we've got the natural fifth on the A minor chord, third and flat 9 on the D7, and then the fifth on the G minor chord. This is a nice way to play it because it gives you a little bit more movement. If, for instance, like Blues for Alice, the second bar is like this as well. If you play, let's go back to C minor for a second. You get this chromatic line running down, which is useful. And I also like using the minor 13 flat 9 chord on the 5 of the minor key. Another example of that sort of thing would be from Invitation. We've actually got a, if I transpose it to our key, a D minor 9 chord there. Hipper. And it's kind of chromatic, we're kind of modulating, but that's a cool sound, you know, like Charlie Christian liked to use that kind of sort of major going into minor. Anyway, I've done a video about that. I'll maybe stick a link in if I remember. Secondary dominant minor 7th, common. Chick Corea seems to be a fan of this for some reason. Turns up in 2 of his tunes, Armando's Rumba and Spain, and probably other ones as well. And this is D7, usually kind of altered D7 sort of sound, going to G7 flat 9, C minor 6th. It also pops up in tunes like Swing Je and so on, a gypsy jazz repertoire. It's very common. As is the next one. This is what I call bluesy minor 2-5-1. So in this, the first chord, the 2, gets tritone substituted for an A flat 7, and usually extended up to the sharp 11th. And this is particularly common in the last few bars of a minor blues, for instance, Equinox by John Coltrane. Okay, this is a beautiful chord because actually that 7th, I mean, you could use a major 7th, which is what B.B. King's The Thriller's Gone does, but if I use a flat 7th, it kind of gives you the flat 9, sorry, the flat 5, beg your pardon, of the C minor key, which gives that bluesiness. So I call it a bluesy minor 2-5-1 for that reason. Classical theorists might note that that is also the augmented 6th chord there, French 6th in this case, in which case that interesting note there technically is an augmented 6th, not a 7th, but I'm going to call it a 7th because I'm a dirty jazzer. Goes up a half step instead of going down. Going down is more bluesy, more jazzy, by the way. And I think that's all I'm going to say about 2-5-1s today. It's a huge subject. Obviously, you can substitute the basic 2-5-1 to whatever you like, and there's tons of information about that. But this is more about sort of recognizing the chord progressions when you see them. In terms of what to listen out for, boom, 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 you know, the chord progressions bass line. Bum, boom, bum, bum, boom, bum is a melody you should be able to recognize right away. And then the qualities of the chords, usually for me, the 2 chord, if it's dominant, has a feeling of being lifted up slightly. So, you know, that sort of feeling. Listening to the chromatic voice leading in the middle voices helps me recognize that chord. Very often these notes are in the melody as well. Always check the melody first to make sure that you know what that progression is by ear. But if you listen to the bass, very often, especially for modern jazz, those chords like bebop and stuff like that, those chords will be played in root position, so you'll be able to hear quite clearly from the bass player. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you find that useful. Please leave any comments below, by the way.